There are many motivating factors for becoming a musician. There's money, fame and success. There's the whole romanticized version of sex, drugs, rock and roll that Hollywood has been selling to us for decades. But I really do believe that if you have a deep calling to be a musician, it is based on an innate need to express something that is within you with the outside world as authentically as possible through the medium of sound. And this is equally true for artists, performers, and basically all creatives across the world. Every one of us has a need to express something deep within us with the outside world as authentically as possible. I'm Eshan Kadaru, aka Push for Life, and welcome to the third episode of Music, Sounds, and Silence. The ideas I'm about to present to you in this episode germinated way back. We're talking like early 90s. Around 92, I was still going to school and I was practicing a lot and I had the dream of becoming a musician, but it really was an intense hobby at the time. And in 93, I moved to London in order to become a professional musician. So once I got to London, all I did was practice, every day. Music was my life basically. I would be practicing. I had a drum kit in my room and I would just be listening to music all the time. I would be going to jam sessions in central London in the evenings. So I was really living, breathing, eating music. Now, as a session musician, which is what I wanted to be at the time, one of your most important skills is that you are fluent in pretty much all major styles of music, because you might get called to do, say, for instance, a wedding or something like that, where you're playing whatever is popular at the time. And then, you might be called to do a hip hop show. And then the following month, all of a sudden, you'll be doing jazz gigs. So you had to really understand all of the major styles of music that were current at the time. So I did my best to study all of the greats as well as I could, at least at the time. Remember, we're talking early 1990s when there was no World Wide Web as we know it right now. There was no iTunes, there was no YouTube where you could just go and enter a bunch of musicians and have access to live concerts or most of their catalog. But I was lucky at the time because the town that I was living in, which was Croydon in England, which is just outside of London, they just built a brand new state-of-the-art library, and I did have access to pretty much any CD I wanted at the time because they had all of that stuff in there. I studied album by greats like Miles Davis or even Sting, and more contemporary artists at the time like Michelle Ndegeocello, and I remember just really trying to crystallize out of this music what made a particular style. Now, after years of doing this, I did have a very important insight that would affect the way I perceived music and also the way I would make music. And this insight was that styles of music didn't just exist and they didn't just come into existence, but they all have their root in a certain musician or a group of musicians whose self-expression is so radical and so innovative and so authentic that it then starts resonating deeply within the circles of musicians around them, who then end up emulating them, not copying them, but emulating them. And through this emulation, certain patterns and certain stylistic preferences start to crystallize that then become, a deep-seated style, such as hip-hop or jazz or rock, for instance. So once I had this insight, this realization, so to speak, a light bulb went off in my head. I realized that I no longer just wanted to study what made certain styles tick, so to speak, but I wanted to understand what was my voice, what is it that was within me that I wanted to express and share with the world. So I moved away from studying stylistic exercises, and by that I mean, learning, for instance, certain jazz patterns or studying whatever, hip-hop feel was in at that given time. And I decided to move more towards more rudimentary exercises. And as a drummer, that meant learning more coordination-based exercises and technique, and also timing exercises. And all of this in order to create a foundation within my body that I was able to express any given idea that I had immediately without any internal barriers, so to speak. And it was through years of this practice that I realized that there are actually two aspects to us as human beings that are necessary in order to express ourselves authentically. And these two aspects are the mind and the body. First, let's take a look at the mental aspect of being a musician, using the mind. When we express ourselves authentically, we are tapping into pure, raw creativity. No one really understands where this comes from. What we do know is that our minds are the first step in the process of making that creativity tangible. You could say it is the director of the creative impulse. And there are various faculties of the mind that assist us in getting that raw creativity out there into the world in its purest form. And these include attention, awareness, being present, concentration, and discipline, to name a few. Without training these faculties, our minds can become scattered, and that pure signal of creativity which we wish to express will become distorted and possibly even incomprehensible. So it is crucial that we take good care of our minds and intentionally develop these faculties in order to facilitate our primary goal, which is authentic self-expression. And now let's take a look at the physical aspect of being a musician using the body. Now, if we define our mind's main purpose as being the director of the creative impulse, then our bodies are the executors of that creative impulse. They execute what it is that the mind is telling it to do. So if you are a normal, healthy human being, your body should feel like one whole unit. But if you look a little below the surface, you will see that there are many different systems coexisting at once, three of which are of primary interest to us: the skeletal system, the muscular system, and the nervous system. So let's go through them one by one. The skeletal system is defined as the framework of the body, consisting of bones and other connective tissues, which protects and supports the body's tissues and internal organs. Now, as a musician, or any performer for that matter, it is important to understand and develop an awareness of how your skeletal system works and where its limitations are. The more you practice your instrument, the more you will discover certain optimum movements that work best for how your bones and joints function. Then there is the muscular system, which comprises of all the muscles in your entire body. Now, there are many types of muscles, but the ones we are most interested in are the skeletal muscles, of which there are over 600. These are the muscles used to create movement in the body, which is a pretty important thing if you're trying to play an instrument, right? And last but by no means least, there is the nervous system, which is a network of nerve cells and fibers that transmits nerve impulses between various parts of the body. So if we liken our nervous system to a tree, you can imagine the brain being the root, the spinal cord the trunk, and the nerves themselves the branches, branching out from the spinal cord into the body. Now, all of these systems are not only interconnected, but they are actually what make the execution of creative impulses from the mind possible in the first place. You see, the mind sends an impulse from the brain via our nervous system to specific muscle groups that in turn move our skeleton in a very specific way to perform certain movements. And those movements will express an idea through sound, which in turn travels to our audience and hopefully touches them in a significant way, which is the primary goal of practically every musician that I know. So as you can see, it is not only important to develop our minds and bodies individually, but also to synchronize them. So we have seen how both our minds and bodies have individual attributes that are important for them to function properly. But it is only when we learn to synchronize both of them that we can appreciate the synergistic effects of them working in harmony together as one, and synergistic meaning that the output is larger than the sum of its parts. When mind and body are not working in harmony, we experience things like sloppiness, incompetence, and inconsistency, which then lead to hesitation, self-doubt, and fear. On the other hand, when mind and body are synchronized, we experience things like precision, consistency, flexibility, and control. They lead to self-confidence and trust, which both enable authentic self-expression. The more synchronized our minds and bodies are, the more authentic our self-expression can be. So as far as authentic self-expression is concerned, I believe there are two main paths. I call them relative self-expression and absolute self-expression. Let me elaborate a little. Relative self-expression means expressing yourself relative to a style, and this is something I touched upon a little earlier. So say for instance you're a funk drummer, you're expressing yourself relative to funk music. So whatever, the stylistic crystallization is of funk, you're moving within that realm. I think that makes sense, right? And then there is absolute self-expression, which is when you tap into that creative mode that exists within all of us, where style has not yet crystallized. You are just channeling pure creativity. And any musician who has had some experience in the improvisational fields, for example, has usually had a moment where this raw creativity has shown itself. And when it happens, it is almost like you are standing beside yourself and just observing this energy blasting through your body. And I believe this can be experienced by all human beings. Now, at the end of the day, there really is no right or wrong. It is absolutely fine to express yourself within a style, and you can definitely have authentic self-expression within a style. But I've come to realize that for myself, as a musician, my highest achievement is when I express something that is from within myself in its most purest form. Now, as I've mentioned before, Bruce Lee has had a huge impact on myself as a musician. Remember, I started drumming because of Bruce Lee and Enter the Dragon, but he has also had a huge impact on me as a human being. And in an interview that he did, I think in the mid-70s or so, he also talks a lot about expression and styles and crystallizations. And I would just like to share an excerpt with you from one of his interviews back in the day.
So styles tends to not only separate men, because they have their own doctrines, and then the doctrine became the gospel truth, that you cannot change, But if you do not have styles, if you just say, well, here I am, as a human being, how can I express myself totally and completely? Now, that way, you won't create a style, because style is a crystallization, that way, it's a process of continuing growth.
Now you know where I get a lot of my inspiration from. Alright, so let's try to get to the bottom of what it is I'm trying to get at in this episode. We live in a day and age where many of us use computer technology to assist us in making music, which I think is a great thing. Like I've mentioned in the previous podcasts, I've seen technology grow and expand exponentially, and I really do love it. But there are a few pitfalls to this technology if you aren't careful. One of them being that, generally speaking, if you buy software like Ableton Live or Logic with Apple Loops and that kind of thing in it, you're flooded with other people's expressions. So you end up working backwards. You take someone's loops and then you start thinking, oh, this is a cool loop, let me use that as the basis for my track. And maybe you'll use someone else's sounds. And before you know it, really all you're doing is arranging someone else's creative expression and trying to somehow put your own stamp onto it. But that's a very, very hard thing to do. So what it is that I would advise you to do is to always try to start with a blank slate. And before you do anything, to really think about what it is that you are trying to express in that given moment. And by doing that, you really do have to be present. which is where something like meditation or something along those lines can be very, very helpful for you, because you learn to silence your mind, and then from that silence, that infinite potential, you then can feel within yourself and feel what it is that wants to express itself at that given moment in time. And once you have an awareness of what it is that wants to be expressed, it might be an emotion, it might be an intellectual idea, regardless of what it is, that's when your mind comes into play. And like I said, the mind is the director of the creative impulse, which will then direct your body and allow it to execute that creative impulse. So you basically end up working from the ground upwards. You work from your creative impulse, decide how it is you would like to express that particular creative impulse, let your mind do its part of the work, then you interface with whatever instrument you use, be it a drum kit, a keyboard, a saxophone, or computer technology such as the Ableton PUSH with Ableton Live software. And in order to interface with your instrument properly and efficiently, you have to practice your instrument. And if it is software that you're using, like Ableton Live and the Ableton PUSH hardware, you have to know that piece of equipment inside and out, so that when you have a creative idea, you basically can sort of go on autopilot and let your mind and body express that idea, because you want the signal of that creative idea to be as strong and as authentic as possible in order to touch people's hearts the way you want it to. And what it is that you're actually doing by creating art that is authentic and deep and meaningful is what Kayla Briette talks about in her TED Talk, Why Do I Make Art?, which everyone should check out if you haven't seen it already. And that is that you are building time capsules for your heritage. It really is your legacy to this world, because we're only here for a very short span of time as human beings, really for a blink of an eye cosmically. But what it is that we leave behind, these artifacts, so to speak, really are going to be time capsules in the future for not only, our children, grandchildren, and beyond, but for humanity in general, where we are encapsulating the way we see the world, the way we feel the world, and how we expressed those feelings. If they really come from an authentic place, you will be able to touch people in a way beyond your lifespan on this planet, which I think is something that is deeply powerful and ultimately deeply impactful for the human race. And that may sound lofty, but if you do create authentic art and authentic self-expression, that is exactly what you're doing. You are leaving something behind for future generations that will nourish them on a deep level. So on that note, I'm going to leave it at that for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to like and subscribe if you're on YouTube, and also, if you can, leave me a rating on iTunes. That will definitely help me along in the future. Take care for now, and I look forward to seeing you in episode 4. And in the meantime, make sure to check out musicsoundsandsilence.com for the show notes that will have various links and resources. Till next time, peace.